Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode in looking at the return to Zion, Shivat Zion. And what we're going to be looking at tonight is the building of the temple. What was keeping people from building the temple? What was the attitude towards the temple? And what we're going to do really tonight is look at mainly two sources. Namely, we're going to be looking at Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're going to be looking at Haggai. Okay, because they kind of fill in for each other. And one of the things I'm going to be saying about Ezra, as I frequently do, is that it is very much an edited work. And we're going to see some of the kind of stitches tonight as we look at how the book of Ezra explains the building of the temple and explains what the problem was, what the difficulty was in building it. So let's start with Ezra. And Ezra presents something pretty clear. The first people who come, so on the one hand, it says people came with Zerubbabel, right? However, the first ruler, as it were, is Sheshbazzar, right? In the very beginning, so part of what Cyrus does, at least according to the book of Ezra, is he returns some of the kelim, the vessels that we had in the temple, and he gives them to the returning exiles. And this is brought up with the leadership of Sheshbazzar. Sheshbazzar is called a nasi, a prince. He seems to be the first pecha, the first governor of Judea with returning exiles. We don't hear a lot about him until we will see, and a little spoiler alert, we're going to see in a letter later on that Sheshbazzar is actually credited with starting the building of the Beit HaMikdash, which is one of the reasons why traditionally, at least partly traditionally, and certainly according to several of the commentators, Sheshbazzar is Zerubbabel. Sheshbazzar is simply the Persian name of Zerubbabel. The question is, with a name like Zerubbabel, do you really need a Persian name? But that is the argument, that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are the same person, because otherwise you have a problem. Because we'll see that in the book of Ezra, in the prose, it's very clear that it's Zerubbabel who starts building the temple, and yet in the letters that we'll see quoted, it is Sheshbazzar who starts building the temple. Let's jump in to Ezra Perek Gimel, Ezra chapter 3. So we get to the 7th month, and the people of Israel are already in the cities, and the whole nation joins it. It's Rosh Chodesh. It's the beginning of the month. So they all join as one man to Jerusalem. Vayakam Yeshua ben Yotzadak v'Chavakonim. So Yehoshua, the son of Yotzadak, and his brethren, the priests, and Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel v'Achav, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shaltiel, and his brethren, I should say, Vayivnu et mizbach Elohei Yisrael la'alot alav olot kakatuv b'Torat Moshe ish Elohim. And they built the altar of the God of Israel to bring sacrifices, as it is written in the Torah of Moshe, the man of God. So they already know what there's the Torah as it's written. They are going to bring sacrifices, and it says, and this is interesting because it doesn't make sense. They built the temple because they were afraid of the nations of the land, and then they brought sacrifices morning and evening. Now, they were afraid? You could say there are two different possibilities. One, they built the altar and not the temple yet because they were afraid, or they built the altar really despite the fact that they were afraid. Even though they were afraid, they built the altar and they managed to do it, right? So it's the key, the because is a little bit hard there. It's not clear what the association is. They did the festival of tabernacles of Sukkot, and they brought the different sacrifices of each day. If you guys are familiar with the sacrifices of Sukkot, they're different every day. So they brought the appropriate number of sacrifices for every day, and they did olat tamid, the regular burnt offering, and the offering for the beginning of the month. Yeah, they did for all the holidays, right? from the first of the 7th month, they started to bring sacrifices to God, but they had not even established, they'd not even started the building of the temple. And then they paid for everything they're going to need to build the temple. Uvashana hashenit, already in the 2nd year, livo amel betel Elohim liyushalayim, to their coming to the house of God to Jerusalem. בחודש השני החלו זרובבל בן שאלתיאל ויהושע בן יהוצדק ושאר אחיהם הכהנים והלוויים וכל באי מעשרי ירושלים ויעמידו את הלוויים מבין 20 שנה ומעלה לנצח על מלאכת בית השם. So in the 2nd year, they come, they set up all the priests and Levites who are going to be busy with the service of the temple. And so they have everything set up, and then they set the foundations. ויסדו הבונים את היכל השם, ויעמידו הכהנים מלובשים בחצוצרות, והלוויים בני אסף במצלתיים, להלל את השם על ידי דוד מלך ישראל. So what did they do? The priests are dressed in their appropriate priestly garments. They have their trumpets, and the Levites and the sons of Asaph with cymbals. They're all singing and giving praise to God. According to David, king of Israel, one assumes that what that means is they're saying psalms, right? They're singing psalms and they're saying praise and with thanks to God because his favor is eternal. Al Yisrael, on Israel, v'chol ha'am heriu tru'ah gdola b'alel Hashem al usad bet Hashem, and everyone blew a great trumpet, or you could say simply everyone made a whole tumult in praise of God that finally the foundation of the temple has been laid. ורבים מהכהנים והלוויים וראשי האבות הזקנים אשר ראו את הבית הראשון ביוסדו, the many priests and Levites and heads of households and the old people that saw the first house when it was established, זה הבית בעיניהם, that house with their eyes, בוכים בקול גדול ורבים בתרועה בשמחה להרים קול. They are crying out loud with a lot of noise, and the other people who are speaking, who are the younger people, for whom this is the point, they're like, yay, are drowning them out. They're raising their voices in a way to drown them out. ואין העם מכירים כל תרועת השמחה לכל בכי העם, כי העם מריעים תרועה גדולה והכל נשמע עד למרחוק. And you couldn't tell, the people can't tell from the sound of joy, between the sound of joy and the sound of crying, because the entire nation is just making this tremendous amount of noise. And this encapsulates this struggle of the initial return to Zion, because here there are these great hopes and this tremendous disappointment. What, is this all there is? Is this what there is? And we're going to see this theme in Haggai. In fact, one approach to Ezra is that the verse in Haggai is actually first, because the verses in Haggai are actually written at the time of these things happening. And it says, oh, this is small. If you remember, we also read it very quickly last week. This house is small in your eyes. And that is actually being echoed in the retelling of the story here. And so here they are. They've started the temple. They're making a big deal out of it. And so the enemies of Judah hear that the returning exiles are building the temple for the Lord God of Israel. ויגשו אל זרובבל ואל ראשי האבות ויאמרו להם, נבנה עמכם, כי חכם נדרוש ללכם, ולא אנחנו זוכרים ימי אסר חדון melech Ashur hamaleh otanu po. They go to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the households, and they say to them, let us build with you, because just like you, we also seek out, we also come to beseech your God. We have been sacrificing to him since Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, who brought us here. Since then, and you all are familiar with the story in Kings, that the lions were attacking them, and they said, what do we need to do? And they said, well, you need to worship the God of this place. And they started worshiping the God of this place, namely the God of Israel. And they say, we would like to worship with you, right? And the answer is, Vayomer lehem Zerubbabel b'Yeshua u'shar rashi avot Yisrael, lo lachem v'lanu livnot bayit l'Eloheinu. They say, no, it's not for you and for us together to build a house for God. Ki anachnu yachad nivneh l'Hashem Elokei Yisrael. We will together build for the Lord, the God of Israel. The same way, the way Cyrus commanded us. They're like, hey, the king gave us leave. You guys have been here. We now got leave to build this temple. We're building the temple. And the people of the land, the inhabitants of the land, weakened the hands of the nation of Yehudah, and it kept them and made them afraid of building. How did they do that? They bribed ministers to go to the king and stop their plans. And during the reign of Ahasuerus, Xerxes, right, in the beginning of his kingdom, they wrote kind of nastily an accusation against the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem. And now we switch to Aramaic. Now, remember when I said Ezra was a heavily edited work, and it leaves the stitches for us to see. All of a sudden, we're reading in Aramaic, right? We were reading in Hebrew, now we're in Aramaic. So we can kind of see, okay, this is a different source now, all right? And we're going to see that the letters are being brought, apparently are being copied from somewhere. They're not going to support what it's trying to say. Now, it's already not supporting what it's trying to say because, okay, we have Cyrus and then we have Darius. And spoiler alert, they actually finish, they actually go back to building in the second year of Darius, right? So why are you bringing up letters to Ahasuerus and to Artashasta? This really confused, for example, the Seder Olam Rabbah. The Seder Olam Rabbah said Artashasta is just a name like His Majesty, and so it can apply to any Persian king. We know that this is not true. Let me pull up. This is an Ezra Nehemiah timeline. There were 4 Artaxerxes. Okay, there are 4 of them. Okay, Artaxerxes the first was possibly is 465 to 425 BCE. Artaxerxes the second is 404 to 358. Now, we can pretty much be certain because Nehemiah built the walls that when we talk about Artaxerxes here, we're talking about Artaxerxes the first. Ahasuerus, that's their Xerxes, that's 486 to 465. In other words, these letters that we're going to read are written much later than any letter that could have stopped them from building the temple. In other words, we're bringing letters that actually don't have anything to do with this. And what do they have to do with? We're going to read them quickly. Let's take a look. Okay. It says, Ubime Artaxerxes, in the time of Artaxerxes, Bishlam Mitra Tavel Ushark Navotav, Bishlam Mitra Tavel, and the rest of their colleagues wrote a letter to Artaxerxes, the king of Paras. Uchtav Hanishtivan, Katuv Aramit, and this letter was written in Aramaic and translated. Okay. Aramaic. Concerning Jerusalem, it's about Jerusalem. And he says, let's just skip over everyone who's writing. This is the text of the letter they sent him to King Artaxerxes, the people of beyond the river, right? Ever Anar, right, is a larger area than just Israel, right? So it's the whole area, right? And these are the surrounding nations, as it were, or people who are in this land around Judea. Okay. The Jews who came up from being with you, they went up to Jerusalem. They are building a rebellious and wicked city, right? They are finishing the walls and they are repairing the foundations. What are they building? Are they building the temple? No, they're building the city. King, you must stop them. They are rebellious. This is a rebellious and wicked city. You've got to stop it. They're not going to pay tribute, poll tax, or land tax, and in the end, it will harm the kingdom. But since we eat the salt of the palace, in other words, we get a salary from you, your majesty, we care about what happens to you. And therefore, out of the goodness of our hearts and our loyalty and the fact that we are salaried employees, we are letting you know, king, that this is happening and this is very bad, right? Therefore, we have sent him, we're notifying the king. And then they say, go look in your annals. Look in the archives. Diavaka bisvarta chronaya diavahatach utahashkach bisvarta chronaya vitinda dikiriatadach kirya mirada. Look, sorry, I slipped into my Ashkenazis pronunciation a little bit. You should look in the archives of your forefathers, and you'll find there in the records, you'll know that this is a rebellious city, right? Umahanzakat Malkin Umedina, they harmed kings and states. And it's actually, they caused rebellion. You can't let the city be built. All right. So that's what they advise. And in fact, the king sends back, this seems to be Artaxerxes. He sends back, he says, okay, it's been read, it's been translated for me, or read to me, or explained to me. And in fact, we look through the annals and we find out that this city is constantly rebelling against kings. It's always been rebelling against kings. This city shall not be built until I order. Okay. Now, this is clearly, again, a little spoiler alert, Artaxerxes is clearly in the beginning of Artaxerxes' reign. And that's why Nehemiah has to ask him specifically and say, how can I be happy when my city is in ruins, and get specific permission to rebuild the city, right? So this is during the time of Artaxerxes. And then it says, when they got the letter, so they quickly, when they got the response from the king, they quickly went to Jerusalem, and they went to the Jews, and they stopped them by force from building. And then it says, Bedayin b'telat avidat beit Allah d'Jerusalem, v'havat batla atznak tarten l'malchut Darius melech Paras. So at that time, the work on the temple and the Beit Mikdash in Jerusalem stopped until the second year of Darius. Now, realize how screwed up this chronology is. This chronology is completely wrong, right? It can't happen. It's absolutely impossible, right? So what's interesting is that on the one hand, what's going on is the author of Ezra wants to convince us that there was a really good reason that they didn't build. And that really good reason was that the nations around them scared them. And not only that, they got an order from the king that they weren't allowed to build. And therefore, they didn't build. Now, it could be that, in fact, they were scared of nations around them. However, there was no order from the king not to build. In fact, Cyrus had said to them, build. And we'll see that Darius, as soon as he kind of gets the word that Cyrus allowed them to build, he's all for it. So that's not what stopped them from building. It could be that there were tensions with the nations around, but what else could there be? Okay, what happens in the second year of Darius? And in fact, let's actually look in the second year of Darius. That is when Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, and as they start saying, hey, we've got to build, right? Nabi Haggai, and we're still in Aramaic, right? Nabi Haggai, a Neviah, Zechariah bar Iddo Neviah, al Yudaye Devihud of Yerushalem, Mishum Elal Yisrael. They prophesied in the name of God of Israel to the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem. So that's when Zerubbabel and Yoshua, the son of Yotzedek, finally actually started rebuilding the temple, right, with the prophets. And we'll see what in fact happens is that there's a little bit of tension, there's a little bit of a problem that is very quickly overcome. Now, it's very possible that this is also what it's saying is, why is it quickly overcome? Because God's on their side, right? But let's just take a look. So who comes? Tatnai, who is the governor of Avar Nahara, the whole area, right? And his colleagues, and this is what they say to them. Man sam te'en baita dina libnei, v'usharna dina l'shachlala. Who gave you the order to build this house and to finish these walls? Right? Edayin kinema amarna lahom, ma inu shmat guvraya di dina binyan. And then we said to them, it's a typo, they said to us, who's building? All right? And who's responsible for this, right? Ve'en alahaham havat al savei Yudaye, ve'lava tiluhimu atam l'darya v'shehach, ve'dayin yitivun l'shtivana aldina. God's eye was on the elders of the Jews. They didn't stop them until an order came from Darius, right? So they sent a report to Darius and they were waiting and they got a letter. So what's the point here? What they could have said was, hey, Darius is the king. We don't see an order from Darius. You stop until we hear from Darius. But that's not what they did. In other words, the local rulers who before we read a letter about how they were telling the king, look, you can't have a city. You can't let the city of Jerusalem be built. When they see the temple being built, they say, hey, whose order was it? They don't stop them. They let them continue to build while they check. So they sent to Darius and they write, right? Let the king know, and note the different tone here. They're not saying, oh, wow, this is a horrible thing. They're letting the king know. Memo, right? Let it be known to the king. We went to Yehuda, right? To the house of the great God, and it's being built of hewn stone and with wood, right? The work is being done well. It's going ahead. They're succeeding at it. So we asked, hey, who ordered you to rebuild this house? And we also asked their names, right? So that we could write down their names. We're doing our job, Your Majesty, right? And this is what they said to us. Anachna himo avdohi dir ala tishmaya va'ara uvanayin baita dihava b'nei mikidmat nashnin sagian umelch Yisrael rav b'nahi v'shachlale. We're the servants of the God of heaven and earth. We're rebuilding the house that was originally built many, many years ago. And the king of Israel, the great king of Israel, he built it originally. And then since we got God angry, right, he handed it over to Nebuchadnezzar and he exiled us. Okay, but Cyrus, but Cyrus, he essentially gave us an order to rebuild it. In other words, this is a order from Cyrus. Now, it's very important to Darius. Darius was not for so many of the Persian kings, they were not actually the sons of the previous king. So it was very important to them in general to say, I'm a continuation of the previous king. This is a temple that always existed, but also, hey, this was a command from Cyrus. And Cyrus even returned all the vessels from the Beit HaMikdash, right? And here he said to be given to Sheshbazzar, right? Shmedi Pecha Samed. He's the guy, Sheshbazzar was appointed Pecha, and he gave him all of these vessels to bring back. Okay, he said, take the vessels, go. According to this letter, Sheshbazzar is the one who starts building. Adain Sheshbazzar dech, ata yahavu shaya divet elad divrushleim, umin adain vad kaan mitpenei v'lashlim. So he says, that same Sheshbazzar, she laid the foundations, and from then until now, it's being built and it hasn't been finished. Okay, so they're acting like, and this is also kind of to help their argument, like we didn't stop and start again. We've always been building it. It's just been taking us a long time. And again, they say, you know what? Check the archives and you'll see that there's an order from Cyrus. There's an order from Koresh to build the Beit HaMikdash. They finished quoting the Jews, and now they're saying, so Your Majesty, could you check in the archives and see if in fact there's an order from Cyrus, right? And then tell us what you want to do. So then Darius, in fact, searches the archives, and they find it. They find the memo from Cyrus. If we look here, it says, let the house be rebuilt, a place for offering sacrifices with a base built up high. Let it be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, with a course with timber for 3 rows of stone, and the expenses shall be paid by the palace. That's why it's important to say how big it is and what it's going to be built for, because if it's going to be paid by the palace, you have to know, right? And then all the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash that Nebuchadnezzar took are going to be returned. Okay, so all of this is being quoted in the letter back from Darius. And Darius says, now you, Tatnai, Pachat Avar Nahara, that the Pecha of that whole area of over the river, or beyond the river, stay away from them. Stay away from the place. From there, rather. You should let them build the temple on its site. And we see what Darius thinks the problem has been. He says, I'll give them money. Why haven't they gotten it built? They must not have the money. I will help, right? This is a classic thing. He says, I'm going to pay, okay, out of the resources of the king from the taxes of your province. Your province's taxes are going to go at least partly to this temple being built, so that the work is not stopped. So it shouldn't stop again, right? Because clearly they ran out of money and they stopped, and that's not good. Let's just finish this temple, and it's not. Then I don't have to get letters, right? And not only that, we're going to donate sacrifices. Why? So that they will offer sacrifices and pray for the life of the king and his sons, right? I give them money for sacrifices. They pray for my well-being and my son's well-being. It's a classic setup of an emperor who says, like, hey, I want everyone to worship their gods, right? And anyone who changes this decree is going to die. Okay, that's a good way to end. All right. And how much of this is all from Darius? Like, it's the whole story about, and the reason that our temple was destroyed is because we didn't listen to God. Is that whole thing in the letter to Darius? We don't know. But clearly, these letters are, in fact, drawing from letters to and from Darius. At least it seems that way, right? And then they continue building, and they, in fact, finish it again on the 3rd of Adar in the 6th year. Remember, they started in the 2nd year of Darius. And they have the dedication. And I'm doing this quickly because we have lots more to look at. They have the dedication. And it's funny because this dedication we don't get the whole story like we did at the founding of the temple, right? This dedication is like, okay, they sacrificed a lot of animals. They appointed the priests and the Levites. They celebrated Passover, right? And that's really nice. And then we're done. But there isn't the same idea of, wow, everyone was waiting for this and they blew the trumpets and some people were crying and some people were joyful, and we don't get any of that. It's like, finally, the temple's done. Now we can build sacrifices. Now we can celebrate. Now we can have Passover. So that's where it ends. And what it seems like, and again, we're not done with the book. If we, in either next class or in a future class, we'll look at building the walls of Jerusalem, and we'll see that it's a much bigger deal. In other words, it seems to be much harder, because that is a point, as we already saw in the letters that we read, that's something that the nations around really, really don't want to happen. And it's hard for us to understand how meaningful the walls of Jerusalem were to the people, to the returning exiles, and to the nations around, where it was really considered a threatening thing to build the walls of Jerusalem specifically. And at the same time, by the returning Jews, it was considered tremendously meaningful and important to have those walls built. I see that there are things in chat, so let me pause and look at the questions and comments.
Miriam, who wrote Ezra and who edited it?
Okay, so we don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a highly edited work. There are places that are clearly like written. So for example, if you ask Sarah Yafet, who is like one of the experts on the book,
mm-hmm.
she will say that the passage that we read in Ezra Gimel, in Ezra 3, about the dedicating the altar. So she sees this as written by the final editor, in other words, written late. And she thinks it's actually drawing from Haggai. In other words, it's drawing, and that's why it's not saying that Sheshbazzar started building. It's saying that Zerubbabel started building, because from the point of view of Ezra and Nehemiah, it keeps it to just a couple of generations. Like, the important generations are Zerubbabel and Yoshua and Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are the 2 generations, and it kind of is trying to set it up that way. And Sheshbazzar, who knows anything about him? They've already forgotten about Sheshbazzar. That's what she interprets. And therefore, it's saying that Zerubbabel is the one who built it, even though in the letter that is quoted, that is sent when they are finally rebuilding, it says Sheshbazzar is the one who started it, and we've been working on it till now. That's what it says. It says Sheshbazzar, and that's why commentators say they're the same person. But that's hard to believe when it says specifically that Sheshbazzar, a Nasiya prince, was the first Pecha, right? It's a little, it seems like he's a different guy.
Whoever wrote Ezra is now writing, it seems like, as the events are occurring.
Whoever's writing Ezra is collecting different sources and putting them together, writing certain passages, right? So, for example, we have this written passage in Hebrew, and then all of a sudden we're in Aramaic. Yeah. We're clearly working with different sources. In other words, we're brought some Aramaic letters. Those are obviously sources, but now we're just prose Aramaic. So it's just a work that's edited with different sources. Now, Nehemiah is different because it is spoken, most of it is in the first person by Nehemiah, right? So either someone's writing in his name or he's writing in his own name. And he absolutely seems to be saying, hey, this is what I did. This is what I did. This is what I did. I hope everyone remembers me for good, kind of thing. Like, hey, remember that I was a good guy, right? And this, I did this and this and this and this, and this is what I did. And then I found out this, and then I did that. And so there's much more of a feeling of it's being written by someone, by Nehemiah, right? Or his scribe. You're like, it feels much more of the time, where here we've got different sources. Someone sat with sources, someone sat with letters and is bringing letters to underline a point. And someone's writing in Hebrew and then bringing sources in Aramaic and not translating them into Hebrew, leaving them in Aramaic for us, right? So you really, with Ezra, you really see the pieces. You can't say, oh, hey, the entire thing's written by one person, because clearly some is in Hebrew and some is in Aramaic. Right?
Your idea that Ezra's a really edited book. What's edited out is any reaction to Sheshbazzar or Zerubbabel leaving the scene. We don't know if the people were upset, if it didn't mean anything. And that to me seems like a big omission in this whole story of Shivat Zion. You come with a lot of excitement that sign of David HaMelech is back, but you never get the disappointment that he doesn't stay.
The disappointment that Zerubbabel doesn't stay?
Yeah, we don't hear that. I think it's we talked last week that it's not, you said that there's no mention of him, but we don't, I'm assuming that people would have reacted, but we have no idea what the reaction was with his leaving. That's edited out someplace. It's not part of the story, and it seems it would have been part of the story. So I'm just kind of questioning that.
It's edited out of the story, and I do think because it wasn't dramatic. I think that it was a non-dramatic thing, and I think it's edited out of the story again because it's looking back. If we had something that was a more contemporary account, for Haggai, it must have been a tremendous disappointment for Haggai and Zechariah. It must have been tremendous, and I think they just stopped talking. They don't. Again, we saw it in Zechariah that he just stops mentioning him. He just stops naming him, right? So it's hard. I think if you're a prophet and then your prophecy kind of doesn't happen, I think that really sucks. And we're going to have, in one of our classes, we're going to discuss kind of the end of prophecy during this period and what happens in belief in prophecy. When Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel give a prophecy and it doesn't happen, they're like, oh, that didn't happen, right? And they don't think that now they're not a prophet, or it doesn't hurt their prophecy. And I think that already at this period that maybe it would. Not that it hurts them, but I don't think that Haggai and Zechariah, they're not going to directly address the fact that it didn't come true in this period. I wonder if that's because prophecy is already started to be kind of doubted a little bit more. Cheryl, I see your hand.
I would take a more cynical view. I don't know if it's cynical or not. Not is that it did have an effect, Zerubbabel leaving, but it doesn't fit the narrative of the people who are editing it, and so they don't put it in. Like, if the people were disappointed, they don't want to say that, and so they don't write about it.
And I agree, but it's also a level of disappointment. See, I'll tell you. So Ezra and Nehemiah, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah again, there isn't this belief in a king. You don't have to have a king. You have to have a good leader, and that good leader is not a Messiah. They're not supposed to bring some kind of apocalyptic end, right? They move on and someone else takes their place. So for Ezra and Nehemiah, the way it's setting it up is you had Zerubbabel and Yoshua. They did their job. They built the temple. Now we have Ezra and Nehemiah. They do their job. They build the city and they bring the Torah. So they do their job. So that's the framework of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it's important to remember that is, in fact, the framework of Ezra and Nehemiah. It doesn't have the same expectation of Zerubbabel as Haggai and Zechariah do. and I see them already at the end of the hour. So we're going to be diving into Haggai next week, and we'll see what else we can expand on there in terms of the building of the temple. But what we saw in this class was a kind of struggle, a way to deal with history, as you were saying, where we're looking back and we're saying, why didn't they build the temple? Why didn't they build it? So it's set up that the reason they didn't build it was because they couldn't build it, because they were scared of surrounding nations. But not just that, the king actually ordered that they couldn't build it. And we saw from the letters brought by the book itself that this was not true. The letters are talking about building the city of Jerusalem. They're not talking about the temple. When they finally start to build the temple, as the book of Ezra assures us, actually God's on their side, and they let them build even while they're checking with the king. And then when the king hears, he's like, oh, here's money. Here are sacrifices. I want to make sure that they can finish the temple now. And they finish it and they build the sacrifices. So it actually seems to go relatively smoothly once they start. So next week, we're going to look a little bit deeper in Haggai, where Haggai addresses the issues that they have with building. And while it absolutely could be that they couldn't continue building in the time of Cyrus because they were scared of surrounding nations, just because the king didn't stop them doesn't mean there wasn't tension with surrounding nations. But it seems to be that a big reason they didn't build was simple poverty and possibly inertia. And we're going to see both of those things talked about in Haggai when we read it next week. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week. Take care, everyone.